The air in apartment 213 was thick with the chemical stench of decay and cleaning agents, a failed attempt to mask an unspeakable truth. A blue barrel sat in the corner, a gruesome container of secrets. In the refrigerator, severed heads kept silent company with jars of human organs. This wasn't the set of a horror film. It was the reality, crafted by a quiet, unassuming man from Milwaukee. For over a decade, Jeffrey Dahmer's private world was a laboratory of death, driven by a loneliness so profound it twisted into a desire for total possession. But how does a shy boy become a monster? What happens when the fear of being left alone becomes a motive for murder? This is part 1 of Jeffrey Dahmer, Inside a Killer's Mind. To truly understand the man, we must meticulously dissect the life of the boy. Born on May 21, 1960, Jeffrey Dahmer's early life was a case study in emotional neglect and psychological instability, hidden behind the facade of a middle-class suburban home in Doylestown, Ohio. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was a research chemist, a man of science who was often emotionally and physically absent, consumed by his academic pursuits and career. His mother, Joyce, was a teletype machine instructor, a woman plagued by severe mental health issues, including depression, anxiety, and what Lionel described as a litany of psychosomatic complaints. She was often heavily medicated, leaving her emotionally volatile and largely unavailable to her young son. The home was not a sanctuary. It was a battleground of constant, bitter arguments. Young Jeffrey was not a participant in these fights, but a silent observer, absorbing the tension and learning a devastating early lesson: that intimacy and connection were sources of pain and conflict. He was left adrift in a sea of his parents' turmoil, a quiet, anxious child grappling with feelings of confusion and a burgeoning sense of abandonment that would later metastasize into the core of his pathology. While other children were learning the fundamentals of social bonds, of trust, affection, and security, Dahmer was learning to cope with an ever-present void. This emotional vacuum became the space where his darkest fantasies would eventually take root and flourish. The first clear warning signs emerged from this profound isolation, taking a form that seemed, on the surface, like a macabre scientific curiosity. Around the age of 10, Dahmer developed a deep fascination with the dead things he found in the woods and on the roadsides near his home. He began collecting animal carcasses, squirrels, birds, raccoons, and taking them to a small shed behind his house. There, he would dissect them, dissolving their flesh in chemicals to expose the bones beneath. His father, seeing this as a potential interest in science, even encouraged it, showing him how to bleach and preserve the skeletons. But this was not the simple, healthy curiosity of a future biologist. For Dahmer, this was a formative exercise in absolute control. In the quiet solitude of his shed, surrounded by the silent, inanimate forms of once living creatures, he was a god. He could explore the mechanics of life and death without judgment, without rejection, without the emotional chaos that defined his home life. He could take things apart and put them back together, asserting a power and understanding he felt nowhere else. This morbid hobby was the first manifestation of his obsessive desire to possess and control other beings, to understand their internal workings by literally taking them apart. It was a rehearsal, a chilling foreshadowing of a ritual he would later enact on human victims. As adolescence dawned, Dahmer's internal world grew exponentially darker and more complex. The morbid fascinations of his childhood began to merge with the confusing and terrifying onset of his sexuality. He realized he was gay, an identity he viewed with intense shame and self-loathing, particularly in the conservative environment of the 1970s Midwest. This internal conflict drastically deepened his sense of alienation. He felt like a complete outsider, harboring secrets he believed were monstrous. This turmoil was compounded by an escalating dependency on alcohol, which he began using heavily in his early teens. Alcohol became his primary coping mechanism, a way to numb his crippling social anxiety, to silence his inner critic, and most importantly, to quiet the disturbing fantasies that were beginning to take root in his mind. He began to fantasize obsessively about controlling a beautiful young man, someone who would be his completely, someone who would never leave him. The living were unpredictable. They had their own will. They could reject him, abandon him, just as he felt his parents had done on an emotional level for years. But in his fantasies, he could create the perfect, compliant partner. The line between a desire for companionship and a need for absolute domination was blurring, fueled by alcohol and a psyche starved of genuine connection. The final decisive severing of his familial ties occurred at the age of 18, a critical juncture in his psychological unraveling. Just as he was graduating high school in 1978, his parents' volatile marriage finally imploded. His mother, Joyce, abruptly left with his younger brother, David, and moved out of state. Shortly after, his father moved into a motel. For months, Jeffrey was left completely alone in the family home. This profound, literal abandonment was the ultimate psychological blow. The one physical space that had offered any semblance of stability was now an empty monument to his isolation. It was during this period of intense solitude, surrounded by the ghosts of his dysfunctional family, that his violent fantasies finally demanded to be made real. The emotional dam broke. He picked up a young hitchhiker, a 19-year-old named Stephen Hicks, and brought him home for drinks. When Hicks wanted to leave, Dahmer's ultimate defining fear was triggered. In a panic, he bludgeoned him with a dumbbell, not out of malice or anger, but out of a desperate, twisted need to prevent him from walking away. He later dismembered the body, burying the remains in his yard. The void he had felt his entire life had finally found a method of expression, and it was lethal. The theoretical architecture of a serial killer was now terrifyingly complete. Examining the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer is not a simple task of labeling him a psychopath and closing the book. His psychology was a complex, tragic tapestry of overlapping disorders, all-consuming compulsions, and a profound dysfunction that set him apart from many other serial killers. While he certainly shared traits with psychopaths, such as a shocking capacity for violence and a detached demeanor, his core motivations were entirely different. They were not rooted in a lust for power or a sadistic joy in others' suffering, but in a desperate, pathological, and ultimately destructive form of attachment. To truly understand him, we must dissect the three core psychological pillars upon which his horrific actions were built: his debilitating personality disorders, his all-consuming paraphilias, and the terrifying, soul-deep nature of his loneliness. Psychiatrists who evaluated Dahmer after his capture diagnosed him with a potent cocktail of conditions: schizotypal personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and the paraphilia of necrophilia. Let's break those down. Schizotypal personality disorder is a condition on the schizophrenia spectrum, characterized by severe social anxiety, paranoid ideation, and profoundly eccentric behavior. For Dahmer, this manifested as an almost complete inability to form or maintain normal human relationships. He felt, in his own words, like an alien observing humanity, incapable of understanding or participating in the subtle dance of social interaction. This wasn't mere shyness. It was a fundamental, hardwired disconnect from other people. He found the prospect of intimacy terrifying because it required a vulnerability and an emotional reciprocity he simply did not possess. This disorder explains his lifelong status as a loner, his strange and stilted mannerisms, and critically, why he eventually preferred the silent, non-judgmental company of the dead to the terrifying complexities of the living. A dead body could not trigger his crippling social fears, could not judge his oddities, and could not demand anything of him emotionally. Next, and arguably most central to his crimes, is borderline personality disorder. BPD is a condition defined by severe emotional instability, a chaotic sense of self, and an intense, overwhelming fear of abandonment. This is the roaring engine of Dahmer's pathology. For someone with BPD, the prospect of being left alone is not just a source of sadness, it is a catastrophic, annihilating terror that threatens their very existence. Every one of Dahmer's murders can be traced back to this core terror. He didn't kill his victims out of hatred or rage. He killed them because they were about to leave. In his mind, their departure was a rejection so profound it was unbearable. Murder, therefore, became a frantic, ultimate, and deeply illogical attempt to prevent abandonment. By killing them, he could possess them eternally. They would never walk out the door, never reject him, never disappear from his life. This disorder also explains his chronic impulsivity, particularly his severe alcoholism, which was a desperate form of self-medication to cope with the crushing emotional pain and loneliness that defined his every waking moment. Finally, we arrive at his primary paraphilia, necrophilia, the sexual attraction to corpses. This is perhaps the most disturbing and incomprehensible aspect of his crimes, but within his twisted psychological framework, it is the logical conclusion of his other disorders. If you are fundamentally disconnected from and terrified of intimacy with the living, schizotypal, and you are petrified of being abandoned, borderline, then a corpse becomes the ideal partner. It is passive, compliant, and most importantly, permanent. Dahmer's necrophilia was not just a sexual deviancy, it was the ultimate, albeit grotesque, solution to his relational problems. With a corpse, he could finally achieve the total control and possession he craved. He could explore his sexuality without fear of judgment, and he could indulge his desire for closeness without the risk of emotional pain or the inevitable heartbreak of abandonment. His bizarre post-mortem rituals, bathing the bodies, posing them for photographs, attempting to preserve their skeletons, were all part of this elaborate, horrifying fantasy of creating a perfect, eternal companion who would never leave him. This brings us to a crucial distinction that separates Dahmer from a classic psychopath like Ted Bundy. Bundy was a predator who derived sadistic pleasure from the power, control, and terror he inflicted upon his victims. He enjoyed their suffering. Dahmer did not. He often expressed a strange form of remorse for his actions, not for the victim's suffering, but for the act of having to take a life to get what he truly wanted, the body. His goal was not to inflict pain, but to acquire an object. He drugged his victims beforehand to render them unconscious, not to savor their fear, but to bypass the messy, unpredictable, and terrifying part of interacting with a conscious human being. He wanted the person, but only as a passive, will-less object. Psychopaths typically lack empathy and remorse entirely. Dahmer, on the other hand, was tormented by his own compulsions, aware on some level of their monstrosity, yet completely and utterly enslaved by them. He wasn't a wolf hunting sheep for sport. He was a man drowning in a sea of his own pathology, and in his desperation, he pulled 17 innocent victims down with him. The psychological traits we've discussed did not remain in the realm of thought. They manifested in a meticulous, horrifying, and evolving pattern of behavior. Dahmer's actions were a direct translation of his internal chaos into a ritualized process of destruction. His modus operandi was not random. It was a carefully, if pathologically constructed script to fulfill his deepest fantasies. His victim selection was telling. Dahmer almost exclusively targeted young, attractive men, often minorities, whom he perceived as vulnerable or unlikely to be missed. He would approach them in gay bars, bus stops, or shopping malls, offering money for photos or companionship. This was the first stage of control, luring them into his domain, his apartment, where he held absolute power. Previously, on Inside a Killer's Mind, we journeyed into the fractured psyche of Jeffrey Dahmer. We discovered a man tormented by a paralyzing fear of abandonment and a schizotypal disconnect from humanity. We learned how these pathologies fueled his necrophilic desires, creating a twisted logic where murder became the only solution to his profound loneliness, a way to create a companion who would never leave. We have seen the why behind the monster. Now, we need to confront the how. We will analyze the meticulous and horrifying rituals Dahmer employed, track the institutional failures that allowed him to continue, and witness the final moments that brought his reign of terror to an end. We have now constructed the psychological blueprint of a killer, unlike almost any other in modern history. We have a man defined not by a lust for power or a thrill for the hunt, but by a chilling, desperate, and all-consuming need to stave off loneliness. His mind was a prison, built from the bricks of severe personality disorders, mortared with a paralyzing fear of abandonment, and sexually fixated on the dead as the only safe objects of affection. We understand the why, the fractured internal world that led him to believe the only cure for his isolation was to create a silent, permanent companion from the body of another human being. But this psychological profile, as detailed as it is only half the story. It is the theory, not the practice. The blueprint is not the gruesome reality it built inside apartment 213. How did these dark compulsions translate into a ritual of death that went undetected for over a decade? What were the precise, horrifying steps Dahmer took to turn living men into his compliant trophies? Join us in Part 2, as we cross the threshold from the mind of the killer to the methods of the monster.